Good evening and good morning or good afternoon, whatever it is for you when you are watching this week's episode of Off the Podium. And I am really delighted today to say that my guest is Mr. Mark Dulin, who is one of our intrepid LaGrange Symphony Orchestra trumpet players. So Mark, welcome to the episode and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's my pleasure.
So I've started with this question with a couple of previous guests, but I'm sure our audience are interested to know, how did you come to choose the trumpet, or did it choose you, as is sometimes the case?
Well, I think my grandmother chose it. I wanted to play saxophone in the band, and my grandmother said, you should play the trumpet. There's more solos. So she appealed to my 12-year-old ego, and I started and thank God for that. And so I started in a public school band. I grew up in a little town in South Carolina called Clover. I played in school band and played the trumpet, and there were 3 trumpet players in my beginning band class. And that just seemed to be what I always did. I grew up, was playing in band. I played sports as a kid, but I couldn't hit a curveball. And as I realized that, I practiced more and more, and I had a teacher in high school, a man named John Imsey, who was a really fine lead trumpet player, and he would make cassette tapes for me of Maurice Andre and Clifford Brown. And at that time too, there was a really, because I'm 47, so my formative years would have been the 80s and the early 90s. And around that time, Wynton Marsalis was very popular. He had just kind of come on, and he won Grammys in one year for classical and jazz trumpet. And
wow.
So he was amazing. And when I was in high school, there was a brass quintet. They're really not so functional anymore, but they were called the Empire Brass. And the Empire Brass came to near about 30 minutes away when I was in high school, and I heard them play, and I thought, this is what I want to do. And so it was really, just hearing them play and hearing the couple of recordings I had of Wynton Marsalis. And that was kind of the beginnings of all of it. So I practiced a lot in high school, probably not as productively as I should have, but I knew I knew I had to play a lot. And I will say the same books that I used then are a lot of the same books I use now. You never escape certain books.
Yeah.
And, the process is really the same, though. You listen to a lot of great playing, and you try to emulate it. That was kind of the beginnings.
Fantastic. And yeah, I mean, certainly Empire Brass is still a name that I think kind of resonate very strongly, today for sure. So great model.
Yeah. In particular, there was an album that came out called Class Brass at the time, and it was all these orchestral transcriptions for brass quintet. And when I heard them, I mean, they were on fire, and that recording had just come out, and it was thrilling, and then after that I went to college. I guess that was probably the next place to go. I went to college. I started off at a school called Appalachian State in North Carolina.
Yep.
And I started off as a music ed major there, and then I transferred to Indiana University, where I studied with John Rommel was my trumpet teacher there. My teacher at Appalachian State was a man named Joe Phelps, who had gone to Indiana. He was very supportive, wonderful guy. And but I wanted to transfer because I wanted to do more of a performance-oriented degree. So I got to IU and learned a lot, because it's a huge school.
That's very true.
Yes, 1,700 music majors, I think now. It's still the biggest in the world. They never felt that big to me, I have to say, because the trumpet students in general were very friendly. The brass players, we had some great brass players there. The 2 of the trombones in the Boston Symphony were friends of mine from school. Toby Oft is the principal, and Steve Lang is the second trombone. Nate Zagontzny, he's in the ASO now, was in my brass quintet in school also. I mean, just some fantastic people to be around. And it was a really great time. And then I did my master's degree at Cincinnati Conservatory with a woman named Marie Speziali, whose picture's behind me. playing with Duke Ellington in her first year in the orchestra. I also studied with Michael Saxon, who's a close friend of mine now, the principal trumpet Cleveland Orchestra. Later on, I did my doctorate at Stony Brook in New York. I studied with Kevin Cobb, who's a member of the American Brass Quintet. Also studied with a guy named Jim Pandolfi, who was in the Met Opera Orchestra. He actually had to retire for macular degeneration. But the guy, when you would see him play in the opera, he had a telescope,
right.
all his music blown up, and most of the parts memorized for the second and third trumpet parts of operas.
Yeah, amazing.
Memorized. It was pretty amazing. So, and I would say those people, and then like most American brass players, the Chicago Symphony was a huge influence. New York Philharmonic also, but I was lucky enough to hear Adolf Herseth play a lot at the Chicago Symphony toward the end of his career. And so that was always a big thrill, because we would make trips to Chicago whenever possible.
So I'm going to pick on a couple of threads there. So it's clear to me that some of the very positive influences for you were an early exposure to recordings, as well as obviously a supportive environment as a young musician, and then a series of kind of great mentors at the the undergraduate and then graduate levels as well, and then also just obviously a great cohort of players with whom you got to interact, particularly at Indiana, that gives you such a kind of a great pedigree all around. So yeah, it's an incredibly rich background and a really sort of wonderful trajectory that sort of delivered you to not just obviously the LaGrange Symphony, but just the Atlanta area as a region as well.
Yeah, I feel really fortunate with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, no, it's wonderful to hear. So along the way, have you had any particular challenges as a trumpet player that you've had to sort of deal with and overcome?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are the normal challenges as a trumpet player. I mean, the trumpet, with it, everybody deals with. The trumpet within itself is the most physical instrument, I think. And I say that not to, well, horn. I would say horn also. I would say horn and trumpet, just because it's easier to miss on horn and trumpet. Just it's a smaller instrument. The way the partials are on the instrument, which we can talk about in a little bit.
Yeah.
It is, and when we miss, everybody knows it.
This is true.
It's part of life. We're going to miss notes, but you try not to do too much of that. And so I would say, my beginning background, when I was very young, it wasn't like a great musical background. I mean, I definitely had to overcome things. My parents weren't musicians. School band was kind of so-so. So there was a lot of catching up to do. But I did find that could be an advantage sometimes, because you sort of practice like you had a chip on your shoulder. And it made you more motivated. Yeah. And then midway through my career, when I was 35, I had an injury to my jaw, which was a very strange thing. When I was born, there was a tear in my neck in the delivery, and I had a short muscle on this side, and eventually actually pulled my jaw out of place. And it was sort of a 7 or 8 year process of getting back, kind of a nightmare. I was actually out of music for about a year, and but I knew a month out of that I would be back. It was just a matter of time of healing up, and and I worked my way back and moved to Atlanta.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that isn't obvious from an audience's standpoint for a lot of wind players. So when you look at the strings, and as a string player in a former life, I mean, there's much more sort of dramatic physical motion and this, that, and the other. And from an audience standpoint, I mean, wind players, with possible exception of clarinets, tend to be pretty stable. I mean, there's not a lot of motion there, and we only see with sharp eyes, maybe 3 of your fingers moving. So it's not obvious, I think, from just watching that there is so much intense physicality there. So you talk to us a little bit about just what you mean by how it's physically demanding to be a trumpet player, because I'm assuming you're not really talking about just your 3 fingers.
No, the fingers are the easy part. So to get different notes on the trumpet, the airspeed changes within the trumpet. But it's a very subtle difference. I mean, if you try to control it too much, it's not quite that. But each fingering position, if we were to think about the trombone having 7 slide positions, the trumpet also has 7 different positions. So if I were to say open is first position.
Mm-hmm.
There's 7 notes, and each one of those, depending on the airspeed, gets a wide as high as we can play. So as we change partials, it kind of gets a little higher. The pressure, internal pressure, gets to be a little bit more. And if you're not in good physical shape here to support that, things don't work. So, I mean, I practice 3 hours a day still. And if I have something coming up, maybe a little less the day of, sometimes more if I'm really feeling like I have to do that. And I also play quite a bit when I teach as well. And so, but you have to keep this, the embouchure is what we call this area, and that has to stay conditioned. I think, with no disrespect to my trombone and tuba colleagues, the trumpet and horn, you can hear it a lot quicker when it gets out of shape, and it becomes less stable. So, but you also have to think we're pressing a piece of metal on our face, and so blood is in the lips and there's circulation. So you see some composers really know how to write well for the trumpet, where they know that we need some time off. Sometimes some of the difficulties as a trumpet player are coming in on high things, especially if they're soft, and certain composers understand that more than others. And then but those are the main physical challenges. So every day I spend time just warming up. This is I'll get to show you these trumpets in a minute, but this is a B flat trumpet. This is the C trumpet I mostly play in the orchestra. You can see the difference is the length of the tubing, but the B flat is sort of home base. And so every day I spend time just playing gentle. I'm always trying to condition my body to play as easy as possible, and reminding myself of that every day, because no matter how difficult, the more difficult the music gets, the more we kind of sort of start to strain and start to work too hard. And there's a great phrase that says, great playing is easy. And that's true. When you really are playing great, it really is easy. And so we have to kind of remind myself. So I start very easy. And very gentle playing like that. Might be the first 5 to 7 minutes of my day. And then should I go on about this? I could.
Oh no! Well, I'll leap in here. So all great stuff. So remembering, of course, that the mask of the face and certainly the lips and everything else just have an incredible number of muscles and all kinds of things that help focus that, and that's why, of course, the face is so expressive as a sort of a human communication. So, but to be able to kind of like condition that way above and beyond just the normal use of one's face is quite something. But you've also got, when you're playing, you're obviously having to hold the instrument, and although it doesn't necessarily weigh a great amount, if you hold something even light in place long enough, that's going to create tensions here. So these are all things that you're trying to resolve in the body and have an awareness of, to be relaxed enough, but still put this extraordinary amount of focused pressure kind of through the instrument. So there's a dichotomy there in the balance of those things.
And exactly. And then the other factor that factors into a wind instrument is we can't see the wind. Obviously, it's a gas. and it's invisible. And whereas a string player, they can see the pressure on the bow, they can see the weight on the bow, and they can make subtle corrections in the hand just by visually seeing it. With us, we can't see what's going on inside the mouth.
Right.
And so we have I try to play with a general sense of what I'm doing. And the difficulty, I think, is because we can't see what we're doing. If we try to get too specific with what we're doing, we can get really tied up in knots.
Yep.
So that is and I think any brass player would say that's a constant challenge to stay out of our own way.
Yeah, absolutely. So now I'm fascinated to have you do more of what I've just seen you do, which is you teased us with, here's a B flat trumpet, here's a C trumpet. So we've talked in previous episodes how there's often kind of an extended family of the basic instruments. So we sort of saw that there are examples of that in oboe. We kind of talked about that a little with bassoon, with my terrible joke in a class one day that, well, it's called the bassoon because it's a bass-oon, and then of course discovered that was in fact true. So anyway, so there are many different types or sizes of trumpets. So tell us a little bit about the trumpet family.
Okay, so the trumpet originally was a long, straight tube, or it could have been very different sizes. But if they found a trumpet in the tomb of King Tut. Somebody played it, it shattered. It was a very good trumpet. But then if we were to think about sort of the modern musical time, I guess you would start with really the Baroque period. And the trumpets that they made were long and straight for the most part. There were various derisions of that. There was also a slide trumpet. It was very small. So if we were thinking about the music of Bach and Handel, now we would play it on this piccolo trumpet. But that music back then was played on a long trumpet, and it was very limited to only certain natural harmonic notes that would come out. So there were no pistons, there were no chromatic scales. It was all done with the lip. It was generally very high. Now, and with also in that time, especially you find this in the music of Bach, in B minor Mass, Magnificat, Christmas Oratorio, there are 3 trumpet parts, but the first 2 parts are called clarino parts, and they're the higher parts. And then there was the tromba part, which is more of a bass part playing with the timpani. So this is the piccolo trumpet, which is what, if you hear Penny Lane, piccolo trumpet,
Right.
If you hear Maurice Andre playing Baroque piccolo trumpet music, it's on this instrument. It has 4 valves because sometimes we need a lower note. And anytime you press a valve down on the trumpet, it gives more tubing. And so the 4th valve is a sort of an extender to give us a few more low notes we would play. So that's the piccolo, which I should practice every day, but don't always. And so that was, but in that era, the Baroque period, if we're talking roughly 1685 to 1750, the lifespan of Bach, you had Bach, Handel, you had different national schools. So you had the German school, Bach, Handel, Telemann, and then you had the English school, which would be Purcell wrote a trumpet sonata, and he wrote some music, The Fairy Queen, and then Handel could be English, could be German, depending on how you wanted to write his name. And then you had Italians. The Italians wrote a ton of trumpet music. Torelli, Corelli, Scarlatti wrote a little bit, Stradella. There's so many, and they all end in vowels. So those, but they wrote a lot of solo trumpet music, a lot. Also in that time, sort of slightly before the composers we're talking about, was Giovanni Gabrieli, who's very important for brass players. And Gabrieli was the choir master at St. Mark's in Venice. I should remember that easy. And he wrote for antiphonal choirs of instruments. And so we often play transcriptions of Gabrieli's music, and it was really the first stereo recording. So and that period is mostly relegated to the piccolo trumpet. The E flat trumpet is a horn that we use not as often, but our two real classical period pieces, the Haydn trumpet concerto and the Hummel trumpet concerto, are played on this instrument. And so it's a little bit smaller than it's bigger than the pick, a little bit smaller than the C trumpet. And so if I play a little bit of a scale in this, you'll hear, I'll switch the difference. So. I can't hear how that sounds. We can edit that. But this is the E flat trumpet, so I'll play a little bit more on this. So it's just. If I play that same open note on a B flat trumpet, it's. So a B flat on the piano is a C on this horn. An E flat on the piano is a C on this one. So there's slightly different timbres. And then this, of course, is the C trumpet, which is what we mostly use in the orchestra. And that's an interesting story, too. So when in sort of the earlier, in the early 20th century, the orchestras were very nationalistic in their approaches. And certain countries favored certain instruments. So the Chicago Symphony was a very German orchestra, and they played B flat trumpet. In Boston Symphony was a very French orchestra, and they played C trumpet. The French wrote a lot of things for C trumpet. And but what happened was the principal trumpet of the Boston Symphony was a man named George Magier, and he was the teacher of a young student named Adolf Herseth. And Adolf Herseth played C trumpet because his teacher did, and he won the principal trumpet job in the Chicago Symphony in 1948, bringing with him to Chicago a C trumpet. And everybody wanted to sound like Herseth, and that was basically what happened. And but sometimes we still do use B flat trumpet in the orchestra. Some orchestras do it a lot. The Cleveland Orchestra, there's sort of a tradition of that because there's a real Germanic tradition dating back there. But most of the time in American orchestras, we play a piston C trumpet. Occasionally some rotaries, which I don't own because I don't need them very much. But and I should also mention the valves, because that's something that people want to know about. The valves were invented in, I think, 1813 in France. And the valves, I'll unscrew this one, and you can see there are these holes in the valve. And so if I play an open note, the air is going only through this one pipe and out the bell. But if I press the second valve down, it goes through this pipe and extends it more. And so on. So each time we press the valve, we're allowing the trumpet to lengthen. And that's sort of the way it works.
Right. So again, for the benefit of our esteemed audience, essentially what we're talking about here in terms of the differences between these instruments, it's one part of it would be it's a difference in color or timbre. So you either get sort of like a darker, richer sound or a brighter sound, which is definitely what I would associate with a lot of American orchestras using the C trumpet as sort of like the heroic figure of the orchestra in many scores.
And I forgot this one.
Please.
the super dark one. This is a flugelhorn, more of a German instrument. This is pitched in B flat also, but you'll hear the difference here. Much different than the B flat trumpet.
Right, yeah, for sure. So it's a more sort of, it's a softer, sort of mellifluous sound there, which you kind of brings me to my next kind of bullet point of thinking, which is the trumpet actually features possibly in more different musical styles than most instruments. So we hear it obviously in classical music, and actually the whole range of classical music historically, as you already mentioned, from Bach right through to now, John Williams and forward, and then we hear it in jazz, and we hear it in pop music. You mentioned Penny Lane, which is actually a great example for the piccolo trumpet. So it plays a lot of different kind of roles or kind of dramatic characters within those canvases. And so I'm curious, what are your thoughts about kind of the role that the trumpet plays in the orchestra?
I think it really depends on the period. If you were to look at, like, say, the Baroque period, going back to Bach, if you were a B minor Mass or Magnificat, the trumpet is in many ways a very melodic instrument, but it's also only on the movements generally that are in D major, because the physical instrument of that. But they're very bright, very heroic parts. And a lot of that music is also written very synchronized with the text of the music a lot of times too. So there's a lot of, we would say, word painting or text painting. Okay. The trumpet blends into that sound. Then we became a harmonic instrument. So the high clarino playing kind of went away. And in the classical period, we're talking about Mozart and Haydn, you become very functional in terms of playing with the timpanist a lot.
Okay, so not so much melodic decoration, but more kind of vertical, and you're helping stack the chords.
Yes, a fanfare instrument too, though. I mean, in that it's definitely a fanfare instrument. But yeah, like you said, stacking the chords and being a little bit more transparent. If you notice the trumpet on Mozart, we're probably doing something. But those parts can be quite tricky because there's really delicate, soft entrances. And like I said, if you notice that, we might be doing something wrong. And then Beethoven's sort of an interesting figure because, his first symphony is so set in the classical period, and it's really the second, and my thoughts are the second symphony on, it transitions more into this romantic instrument. And Beethoven does write some tunes for the trumpet. You see that a little bit in Beethoven 3, Beethoven 5, Beethoven 7, not so much, but it's the one that hurts the most to play. And the Ninth Symphony, we have the melody to Open Joy. And then also, and Beethoven clearly understood the instrument too as a fanfare instrument. There are certain little fanfares in all those pieces, the Seventh Symphony, Ninth Symphony in particular, but also the Leonore overtures. There's a backstage on the second and third overtures have a trumpet part off stage, which happens at every audition because it's just a triad. It's just a chord, and if it's out of tune, it's very obvious. And then you go a little further, and then you have Berlioz. Now, Berlioz really did make the trumpet more of a melodic instrument. If you looked at Symphonie Fantastique, Berlioz wrote for cornet and trumpet. Cornet, I've loaned my cornets out, but they are a slightly different sound, but the cornet was a more nimble instrument. So there were solos being written for it. There's an optional part in Symphonie Fantastique in the ball movement, the third movement, where, it was the third movement, right? Yeah, or the second one, the ball. Anyway, it's been a long time since I've gotten to play. But where the cornet actually doubles within the woodwind instruments, and that timbre actually really works. Where's the trumpet? Right. So the French had a big influence of that. And then if you progress, but then after Berlioz, you really progress into the more of the Germanic works. I mean, Brahms is after Beethoven. Brahms occasionally wrote melodic things for the trumpet. We see that in the Second Symphony, probably more so than the others. There's a nice trumpet chorale at the beginning of Academic Festival Overture that he wrote. I wish he wrote trumpet parts that were more like the horn parts in Brahms. I love playing Brahms, but we don't quite get those beautiful tunes that they do. Right. But at the same time as Brahms, there's Wagner. and from Wagner is smaller. Those composers for the trumpet are just huge. And that we definitely take on a very melodic approach to what we're doing. I really think, Mahler wrote the best for the trumpet. He understood where it sounded the best.
Right.
He understood really how to approach the instrument and the way it worked. And I would say Bruckner, which we don't play, unfortunately, as much of in this country, it's very chordal sounds, very, people always compare it to an organ, but these very broad chorale things. And then if you move forward past that, if you go to France, we have Debussy and Ravel. They wrote the trumpet completely differently, very articulate, very much like the language of the French. And then you progress into the 20th century with composers like Stravinsky, of course, really pushed it. Strauss, Richard Strauss, all those composers, Bartok, all these composers write very difficult trumpet parts. They really do. Alpine Symphony by Richard Strauss is a mammoth first trumpet part. And Heldenleben, Symphonie Domestica, Don Juan, all of my favorite things to listen to, but you pay for it. And then those composers lead into, American composers like Aaron Copland and Leonard Bernstein, who were very demanding trumpet parts. Everybody's in the United States, whether they know it or not, has heard Fanfare for the Common Man.
Yep.
Yeah, enjoy.
That's tough.
That's a tough part. You're in unison with three people, which is also difficult sometimes. And then I would say, from there you would look at John Williams and the movie scores of composers like that. So it's progressed. It was a feature instrument, then it was a background instrument, a little less, and then very, very prominent.
Yeah, interesting, and just a wonderfully sort of diverse and also very exciting instrument. But I think it's capable of it's not just kind of the kind of dramatic kind of overflowing sounds. I mean, it's also capable of some beautiful kind of soft timbres and moments in orchestral literature. So we need to not forget those. But really, really great to see how it's evolved through the history of orchestral literature. And of course, what's so much of a challenge as a player today, either as a trumpet player or probably pretty much anything, is there's an expectation that you can play all of those things. I mean, if we were in the Baroque period, I would just be looking at you and hoping that you would be able to play Bach. But I can look at you and expect you to play Bach and Strauss and Stravinsky and Copland. So the demands on you artistically as well as technically to understand that literature and also be able to kind of hold the half a dozen trumpets that you just demonstrated to us at any given moment is really quite a wonderful thing to kind of think about when we are sitting in the audience watching the orchestra on the stage.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, again, kind of going back to the orchestral thing we talked about, we did talk about some of those soft passages, which from the audience, you might think they're not difficult. Believe me, that's where we're really finding it sometimes. If you want to hear beautiful, soft trumpet playing, go to the last movement of Mahler 3, or some of the soft moments in the last movement of Mahler 2, where the trumpet and the voice are almost identical. But you're right, the difference is people hear the trumpet all the time whether they realize it or not. I mean, most people probably don't really think too much about Penny Lane, and they kind of hear the trumpet solo, and that's a pretty tricky moment. The way that happened is interesting, actually, is because Paul McCartney went to a concert the night before they recorded Penny Lane, and it was an all Brandenburg concert, so they heard all 6 Brandenburg concertos.
Interesting.
And he went backstage and he met this guy named David Mason, who was a great trumpet player in England, who just played the Brandenburg on the modern piccolo trumpet. And he said, "Why don't you come to the studio tomorrow?" And so, thank you, David Mason, for making our lives tricky on Pops concerts. But yeah, and then you hear it in pop music all the time. I mean, you listen to, if you hear Michael Jackson Off the Wall, the trumpet playing in that is so crazy, so tough. So
I did not know the story about Penny Lane. That's awesome. I mean, that's a great sort of spontaneous moment that now. I mean, I think that moment in Penny Lane is just terrific because, of course, I'm waiting for that moment probably more than anything else.
It always seems to happen too after one or two songs where the trumpet doesn't play in an all Beatles concert, and the first trumpet player has to sit there and think about it for a couple of minutes. And get really cold, and then come in and play this really demanding solo. It's
great.
It's never in. It's when you play second trumpet on a Beatles concert, you're always like,
yeah.
Luck.
Yeah. Well, just so much we could talk about, but I'm going to kind of draw us to a close here. You tell us a little bit about the other things that you do other than play for LaGrange, because I mean there are a veritable plethora of things, some of which are in fact very closely connected to LaGrange, and something else that you're doing, which I'm kind of excited to see, that is literally connected to the country, if not the world, right now. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I do teach at LaGrange College. I started this year, so we're building things there, and I teach the trumpet students, and I run a brass ensemble. So I'm down there every week. I have a brass quintet here in Atlanta that I play with. I often play with Chattanooga Symphony, different freelance things in town. I publish a couple of books, which I happen to have. I published these 3 books. I co-published them. The subject is a man named Vincent Chikowitz, who was a trumpet player in Chicago Symphony, but he's even better known. He was a fantastic trumpet player, but he was also known as a great teacher, and definitely one of the most important, if not the most important, trumpet teacher in America in the 20th century. And he had music that was passed around, and we all knew these exercises and these etudes he used, but they were in photocopy form. So his son and I collated all this together, and we have recordings of his students playing these etudes and these warm-up exercises. David Chapman, our principal trumpet player, studied with Mr. Chikowitz, and so we put those together, and they sold about 15,000 copies. And we have a version coming out very soon through Hal Leonard for young players that is at the publishers now, and hopefully out soon. And then I also have been hosting interviews like this all summer with different brass players. So in a wide array. The first guest was Gail Williams, who's the former associate principal horn of the Chicago Symphony, one of my favorite brass players ever. Michael Sachs, principal trumpet of the Cleveland Orchestra, was on. Plays with the Philadelphia Orchestra. Doc Severinsen was a guest 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I saw that one.
That was a real highlight because we're talking about early influences. I mean, like every trumpet player that's my age or older, I'm sure we stayed up to see just the commercial break of hearing him play for 30 seconds. And he was terrific, and he's 93 and he still plays hours every day. And last week I had a man named Jerry Hay on, and Jerry is on probably every pop recording, Michael Jackson, Earth, Wind and Fire, Al Jarreau, endless, and writing. He still writes and produces recordings in Los Angeles, and and I just several guests. This week I had Selena Ott, who's a 21-year-old young trumpet soloist who's at the very beginning of what's going to be a very exciting career. And it's been a lot of fun, and everybody's agreed to do it. And it's my teacher Marie Speziali did one, my teacher John Rommel did one. On Marie's, Doc Severinsen came in and surprised her, which was kind of nice. We knew each other, and so that's been sort of a pandemic project, so to speak.
Well, fantastic, and I feel so much more informed about the world of trumpet, and just certainly your connection to that on multiple different levels. So just terrific.
Yeah.
So Mark, man of many trumpets and much talent and connection to our community through the orchestra and teaching at LaGrange College, and just the trumpet universe in general, with these wonderful publications and the interview series and your teaching and playing. It's been a real pleasure to have you on this week. cannot wait until you are on the stage with the rest of the orchestra and the rest of our trumpet section, making great music. And that cannot come soon enough.
Yeah. Well, I'm very much looking forward to it. It's always a pleasure, and we all love playing for you. And yeah, we want to be back when it's all gone and safe.
We'll be back. So, Mark, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.